Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, we're going to create some flowers that you can add to your slow stitching. Or you could add them to a pin and add them to your lapel or a hat or something like that. But the purposes of these flowers is to use ribbon or strips of fabric, and I'll show you how I do that in the video, to create this little dimensional flower. I like to add a button to the center of the flower. It just ties it in with the sewing theme, but I'm sure there are other objects that you can come up with to add for the center. So let's get started.
So here are two examples of the flower that we're going to make today. It's a very simple one. For these I used fabric, but you can easily use ribbon. And at the end of the video, I'll show you some examples of using the flower in your work, as well as making it out of ribbon. You get to see the differences. Now for this project, you can use any width of ribbon that you want. Depending on the width of ribbon, you'll get a different result. The benefit to using ribbon is, aside from it coming in gorgeous colors, it comes in all these different widths. So the smaller the width of the ribbon, the more petals or petal-like objects you'll need for your flower. And likewise, the larger it will be. The ribbon is nice because the edges are finished, so it's not going to fray. But for this purpose, I don't mind the fraying. I'm just going to use a little piece of fabric to make the flower today. It's the same procedure, whether you use ribbon or fabric. The only difference is you don't have to cut up your ribbon quite so much. So no matter what you do, you need to have a little backing, and this could be the piece that you're actually sewing it to. If you're using, let's say, your slow stitching piece, I like to use quilted fabric. It has a little bit of substantialness to it. You could also use just cotton fabric in an embroidery hoop, because the embroidery hoop gives it a little tension and makes it easier to stitch. That's another reason I like to use this little quilted fabric. It just doesn't require that embroidery hoop. It has its own body. So if you're starting with fabric or ribbon, you want to decide the length of your petals, and then you cut them a little more than twice the length. So if for this one, I had to cut this is the length of my petal, I had to cut each strip a little bit longer, a little bit more than double. So since I'm using this little quilt as my backing and this is my fabric, I found a button that coordinates. And the beauty of using a button is it hides your sins of your little ends of the ribbon or the ends of the fabric, and it adds a pop of color, and it's perfectly round. It's a nice addition. You can use something else other than a button if you like. A bead or a found object, or even a little piece of sea glass or a stone would be cute, depending on the flower that you make. So right now I'm going to start by cutting these, and I'm going to use this fabric, and this is going to dictate the size of my flower. So I'm just going to cut the fabric so it's mostly straight. This doesn't have to be a perfect rectangle. I just like to start out with it a little bit straight. Just makes it easy for me overall. And then I want to cut out a minimum of 6, but maybe even more strips of fabric. Now this width is too long for my flower. You can make the strips of fabric any width or any length. I'm going to just maybe cut it down just a little bit. So this is going to be the length of my petal. This is a little more than double the length of my petal. So now I'm just going to cut this into strips, and I kind of like little narrow strips myself. The narrower the strips, the more airy the flower is. Now this particular fabric that I'm cutting, I don't know if you can tell, it has a little bit of a print on it, and that print is made with some type of paint that actually is very textured. So that kind of holds the fabric together a little more than if it didn't have that paint. So I'll see less fraying with this particular fabric. So now that I have a number of these and I have my button, I'm going to just trace around the button. The reason I do that is it gives me a guide for my petals, and I know that all my stitches have to be underneath that button just to make it look a little neater. And I'll cover up that button very soon with fabric, but this is how I start. I have my needle threaded and knotted, and this is just some pearl, and I'm just using what I have an abundance of. You'd want to coordinate it if you could, but you're also going to hide this particular thread, so it's not crucial. I take my strips and I fold them in half. And I like to start at 12 o'clock, but you can start anywhere on your circle. And I make sure that there's an overlap of fabric within that circle. So I'll hold my piece down here, and then I just like to sew 1 or 2 stitches to hold it in place. If I make a long stitch, 1 stitch is fine. And then I just take another strip and I continue. I fold it in half and I just go like the spokes of the wheel, and I can decide how close or how far apart I want them, and it'll give me a little variation. And again, I come up through the base of that fabric that's folded over, and I make a few stitches, whatever I think I need, to just tack it down in place. Because I'm continuing to add folded petals, each stitch will subsequently hold the previous petal down. So I just want to make sure that I'm stitching it well enough to hold it in place at first, and then it'll really secure it with the ongoing stitches. And again, I just continue this all the way around. I'll speed this up while I talk you through it, so that's why it'll look a little unusual, but it's that technique. Now, depending on the fabric you're using or the ribbon for these petals, it might be very thick, so you might have to be a little strategic with your placement of the fabric as well as your stitches. And I like to just keep coming back in and verifying that I'm happy with the placement. You could sketch out like spokes of the wheel with your marker to get the placement perfect, but I kind of like this effect. I like to do this as an activity that it adds just a little element to my slow stitching, or if I just want to make something a little creative, I have some energy and I have a little time on my hands. Now, once I have my last petal stitched down, I'll make a secondary stitch just to really anchor it in place. The stitches underneath the petal are fairly secure, but I just want to make sure that last stitch is secured pretty well. Then I'll knot this on the back. And again, you can add as many or as few petals as you like. And I'm quite pleased with that. You can see in the center how you can really see that center, and it also dips a little bit. So now I'm ready to take my button and decide how I want to put my button, just like that, or flip it over. I kind of like it flipped over. I have 6 strands of white embroidery floss threaded on my needle just to attach that button. And because it has 4 holes, there are different ways you can attach it. Because I'm stitching through so many layers of fabric, it is a bit of a challenge to get that needle in. But I'll stitch it on and then pull my button. I'm just going to stitch through the holes traditionally. I could stitch around them. And again, it's a little challenging to get it through all those layers of fabric, but I will succeed. And once I'm sure that that button is securely on, I'll just knot it. I'll just knot the thread on the back. So now I have my button. I can leave it just like this with the backing intact, and this way I can stitch it on my project, and it gives me a little more leeway. On these, however, I just cut around the edges just to make it a little neater. And this is great. You can add a little pin to the back, or you can take this and stitch it on your work. So that came out very well. Now let me show you some variations using ribbon. So here I took that same technique, and because I used thick ribbon, I didn't need so many petals. I went with like a patriotic theme here, so I have some red ribbon here for the stripes and the stars, and then that whitish button. I have some flowers here made with ribbon, and this one's made with lace. So because I used such narrow ribbon on these two, I had to have so many more petals. And it's fun because the ribbon is such a bright color, and then I can choose a button that really contrasts. This ribbon I really like because it's so airy, the organza there, very pretty. And again, a contrasting button. And then with this one, it's made out of lace. So when I'm ready to use it, I have just a very interesting and very feminine little flower to use. Now to use it in my work, I just took a piece of slow stitching that I had already done, found some of the fabric that matched it, and added a little button right to it. So it adds a bunch of texture, something to play with, and dimensional to my piece. And that's how I make that button.
So that's how I create my ribbon flower to use in my slow stitching. You can vary the size depending on the width of your ribbon, and that will also determine the number of petals that you have. I like to make little teeny ones of these. It's a little tedious to make those little stitches, but the results really can't be beat. And it's pretty dramatic if you make a larger one as well. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. And please consider becoming a member of my channel, where I share behind-the-scenes footage as well as access to a library only available to members. Thanks for joining me today.